Hello and welcome back to Linode. In today's video, we're going to talk about server distributions and answer the question, which distro should you go with for your Linode instance? And this is definitely not a decision to be taken lightly. So what I'm going to do in this video is go over a list of the most common server distributions, and I'll give you my thoughts on each one. I'll give you the pros, the cons, and some other thoughts as well. So let's get into it. First of all, let's talk about Debian Stable. And the reason why I mentioned Debian Stable specifically is because there's actually 3 versions of Debian that you can run. And there's no reason why you can't run any of the versions of Debian that's available on your server. I mean, nobody's going to show up at your house and say, hey, you installed the wrong version of Debian, you're supposed to install Stable. Debian doesn't mind where you install it. It's a distribution that aims to be a general purpose distribution of Linux. So you could install it on whatever is compatible with Linux in general, and Debian Stable is normally the one that most server administrators go with. Why is that? Well, to understand that, you have to know what the other versions of Debian are. We have Debian Unstable and Debian Testing as well. Now, Debian Stable doesn't have like a release cadence that you can actually put on your calendar. It's not like Ubuntu where they have a new release every 6 months. And then, every 2 years, they have a new long-term support release. We'll get into Ubuntu in a moment. But Debian releases when it's ready. And on average, I'm guesstimating is probably like something around every 2 years or so, give or take. So they try to have regular releases as much as they can, but they're also not trying to rush them out the door. Because with Debian Stable, it's all about being stable. Now, Debian Testing is actually the new stable, or what will become the next version of Debian. So right now, as of the time I'm recording this video, Debian Stable is up to Debian 11. So technically, Debian Testing is Debian 12, which is not out yet. At some point in the future, Debian Testing will freeze, and when it freezes, they'll fix all kinds of bugs. They'll make sure that everything is as good as they can get it, and then once they feel it's ready, then they'll release it as the new Debian Stable. Debian Unstable is the closest thing to a rolling distribution that we have when it comes to Debian, because testing isn't technically rolling because it freezes, and I think it freezes for like 6 months or so, so that's quite a long period of time. Debian Unstable, though, is, well, unstable. It's where packages in Debian go first. So if Debian wants to deploy or update a piece of software, then the contributors will actually put the software into the unstable repositories first. They'll test it out, and then maybe it'll graduate to testing. Once it gets into testing, then, more eyes will be on it because more people will have it. And then once it proves itself in testing, then, well, actually, since testing becomes the next stable release, then it's automatically going to be included in Debian Stable. So that's kind of the way it's set up. But when it comes to production servers in the enterprise, it's really uncommon to find Debian Unstable or testing. Most people are actually going to deploy Debian Stable. Another benefit of Debian is apt, short for Advanced Package Tool, and apt is a very common package manager in the world of Linux. Now, package managers are a common element of Linux distributions nowadays. The concept of a package manager isn't specific to Debian, but Debian is the distribution that made this concept famous. At a time when administrators had to figure out how to satisfy dependencies on their own, apt came along and simplified the process. And like other modern package managers, apt takes care of figuring out dependencies for you and automatically installs the packages that are necessary to satisfy a request. Today, the majority of Linux distributions have their own package manager that does essentially the same thing, but there's something to be said of using a distribution that pioneered this approach. So far, Debian sounds great, right? I mean, well, it is. There's a reason why so many people out there love Debian. But as great as it is, there's pros and cons as well that we need to talk about, because it's important to understand what is great about a distribution and some other elements that are either not so great or quirks that I need to mention to make sure that you're aware of. Now, one of the downsides when it comes to Debian Stable is that the packages that are available for download in the repositories are often very old versions. So old, in fact, that on release day, when a new version of Debian Stable is released, it's not uncommon for packages to be several versions out of date. So if you're wanting to use the latest and greatest technology when it comes to Linux, then Debian Stable is not really for you. If that's the case, you might want to consider taking a look at Debian testing or unstable instead. And while I wouldn't actually recommend installing testing or unstable on a Linux server that's going to be used for production purposes, those other flavors of Debian actually do give you access to newer packages. So if that's what you need, then maybe that's something you might want to take a look at. Now, another issue when it comes to Debian is that because of the stable repositories often having older software, that also means by extension that the drivers that are available are often older as well. So that means when you download a brand new stable release of Debian on release day no less, it's not uncommon to install it on a brand new piece of hardware, only to find out that some pieces of hardware in that chassis are not actually supported. And that creates a very interesting issue here, because if you have a brand new server and you really want to deploy Debian on that server, then you might find that you can't. If it doesn't have the drivers that are needed to, recognize the hardware on that server, then you're going to experience things like your network card not being detected, video card not being detected, and who knows what else. And because of that, then your only way of using Debian on that particular piece of hardware will probably be to use Debian testing, which is a downside because I really don't recommend that on production servers. So the fact that Debian has such out-of-date software is something that's a major pain for a lot of Linux administrators out there. But thankfully, if you are using a cloud provider, you don't have to worry about that because they took care of all of that for you. They took care of all the drivers. They make sure that their images of Debian actually work on their platform. So if you are using a cloud provider, you should be good to go. But older software aside, Debian is super stable, it's super secure, it receives security updates for quite a while, and it is a really good distribution, so if your hardware is able to run Debian, then I highly recommend Debian Stable. Next up, let's talk about Ubuntu. It's pretty much impossible to talk about Linux distributions, regardless of whether the intended use case is servers or desktops, because Ubuntu is super popular. I don't think there's a single Linux user out there that's been using Linux for more than a week that hasn't at least heard of Ubuntu. It's that popular. Ubuntu itself is made available for a plethora of different platforms, including a desktop edition you can install on your laptop or desktop, and there's also a version for Raspberry Pi as well. But our talk today is solely about servers, so what I need to do is focus on the Ubuntu server distribution, which is actually a spin of Ubuntu that is targeted for, servers. In fact, Ubuntu is quite possibly the most popular distribution for servers out there, having enjoyed a sizable presence on physical and virtual servers alike. Under the hood, Ubuntu is actually forked from Debian. But Ubuntu is more than just a simple respin of Debian. The distribution contains additional benefits on top of Debian's base that gives you even more features than what Debian itself has available. And some of the added functionality includes tools such as Juju that provide the ability to quickly spin up entire OpenStack and Kubernetes deployments, and services like MAAS, short for Metal as a Service, that enable you to provision physical servers by booting them directly into an installation image. Now, before we go any further, there's actually two kinds of releases when it comes to Ubuntu: intermediary releases and long-term support releases. The way this breaks down is that every 2 years or so, a new LTS version is released, and for the most part, LTS releases of Ubuntu are the recommended versions of Ubuntu to run on servers. Intermediary releases, on the other hand, are what we call the in-between releases. Ubuntu releases a new version every 6 months, and I can only remember one single time in the history of the project that they actually delayed a release. The versions of Ubuntu that are released every 6 months are the intermediary releases, and by intermediary, we are talking about, any release that's not LTS, and all intermediary releases of Ubuntu are supported for just 9 months. And that's actually the reason why no one recommends that they be used on servers, because generally speaking, when it comes to servers, you want that operating system to be around for a while. You probably won't want to actually re-image your servers every 6 months, so it's probably a better idea to stick to LTS releases instead. LTS releases are actually supported for 5 years. And by support, I'm talking about security updates. That's a very important thing to keep an eye on when it comes to servers, because you always want to make sure your Linux servers are fully patched, and it's impossible to do that if you are running an end-of-life distribution. So after 9 months, intermediary releases of Ubuntu will receive no more security updates. Now, like I mentioned, every 2 years, a new LTS release of Ubuntu is published, And the way that breaks down is that you'll have 3 intermediary releases, and then the 4th release, 6 months after the last intermediary release, that's going to become an LTS release. If you were to look at a calendar, the way that plays out is that April of every other year ends up being the year of a new LTS release. So even though each LTS release is supported for 5 years, they come out every 2 years. So there's a little bit of overlap when it comes to support. So that way you don't have to move to the next version of Ubuntu right away. You could wait a little bit. You could wait for a few point releases, for example, before you make the switch. And earlier I mentioned that Debian, one of the weaknesses of Debian, is the fact that it often includes very old software, old drivers, and things like that. But Ubuntu has what I consider to be the best hardware support of any distribution out there, because what they do is they actually include newer drivers. Even when they release a new LTS release, they do go back and then release a newer hardware enablement stack, which is what they call it. And hardware enablement updates actually pertain to, well, hardware drivers. So the fact that Canonical, the makers of Ubuntu, they keep the hardware enablement stack updated for LTS releases, that means you'll have access to newer drivers after release that you normally wouldn't have access to. And that's how Ubuntu actually stays consistent and current with new hardware that's available on the market. Now, when it comes to downsides, the fact that Ubuntu is a distribution that's maintained by a company, Canonical, rather than solely being a community project like Debian is, that's a fact that can sometimes divide the overall opinion of Ubuntu within the community. Many administrators are actually okay with this, while others prefer to go a different direction. Now, to be fair, Canonical has been a great steward for Ubuntu and has helped it reach the heights of popularity that other distributions could only dream of. But on the other hand, there have been some decisions that haven't been met with universal acclaim. However, the fact that Canonical backs Ubuntu might actually be a good thing, depending on how you think of it. Through Canonical, you can actually purchase support, and that's actually a game changer for a lot of enterprises out there, because for some companies, having a support agreement is actually a requirement. In that case, that edges out Debian, unless you find a company that supports Debian on their behalf. But with Canonical, you could buy support, or you could use the distribution for free. There's no limitation to downloading it or anything like that. But if you need support, it is available. All right, so let's talk about Red Hat, specifically Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Red Hat is actually the distribution that I started with, but when I started with it, it wasn't quite the same as it is today. Back then, they made it available completely for free. And technically, it is still free software, but that's a little bit more complicated. We'll get to that in just a moment. But I started with Red Hat back when they had a desktop release available, a Workstation release. Before Fedora was a thing, we had Red Hat on the desktop. It was great. Since that time, though, Red Hat took the distribution in an entirely new direction with a focus on the enterprise, not the desktop. And they do make Workstation versions available, but for the most part, it's most commonly found on servers, so of course it makes this list. Now, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, or RHEL for short, is one of the longest running distributions that we have today. There are entire certifications dedicated to just this distribution alone, and it has a strong presence in the enterprise. Unlike the other distributions on this list, it's not available for a free download. Well, technically, you can get it for free if you actually register as a developer, and that'll give you an evaluation copy of Red Hat that you can use to test out your deployments on, but for the most part, it's considered a paid distribution. But it's not actually the software that you're paying for, though. I mean, it is open source software, so you can't really put a price tag on open source software, so what you're actually paying for is a support agreement, but that's required in order for you to download Red Hat. If you'd like, you could download all the source code and compile it yourself, and if you do that, then you don't owe them anything. You could download all the source code and actually compile it right now, but that's a task that is very difficult for the average administrator to take on by themselves. So thankfully, other distros have taken that on and themselves provide an unbranded version of Red Hat that we'll get to later. But due to the cost, this is a reason why you might not want to consider using Red Hat on your system, because it all comes down to budget. Having a support agreement for a distribution like Red Hat, considering that it's rock solid and stable, would definitely be a great thing for your company. But if you already have a team of Linux administrators in your company, then technically you could argue that there's not as much value with the support agreement because, well, hopefully your Linux team has that covered. And when it comes to the package manager, Red Hat used to use the Yum package manager, but has then switched to the newer DNF. DNF is a package manager you will also find on CentOS and other distributions that share lineage with Red Hat, more on that later. And it's very similar to apt and Debian in the sense that it actually takes care of dependencies for you. There are a lot of differences. Of course, it is a different package manager and the format for packages is different as well. But Red Hat in general is a great choice for the enterprise, as long as you don't mind paying for a support agreement. Next up, let's talk about CentOS. I don't even think it's possible to talk about Red Hat without talking about CentOS in some form or fashion, because for quite some time, CentOS was that on-branded Red Hat, basically Red Hat without the Red Hat branding, so you could actually use Red Hat for free by using CentOS because they are one-to-one compatible. But actually, things have changed quite a bit for CentOS. Like Ubuntu, CentOS is one of the most popular server distributions in existence. It's nearly impossible to read topics within the Linux community and not find it mentioned at least a few times. And with good reason. Like Debian, CentOS is an enterprise-focused distribution with a large number of deployments. Many administrators enjoy its rock-solid stability, and its popularity means that there's no shortage of tutorials and how-tos online, things that can guide you through just about anything you might want to accomplish with it. Nowadays, though, deciding on whether or not to go with CentOS for your server isn't quite the same conversation that it used to be. Very recently, the project actually changed direction. And it's not necessarily a bad direction, but it is a divisive direction nonetheless. In the past, CentOS was a free-to-download recompile of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and a new release of CentOS was the same product as the matching version of RHEL. And the main difference between CentOS and Red Hat for the longest time has been that, well, the Red Hat branding is stripped away and replaced with CentOS branding, which is why you're able to download it without a support agreement. Later on, though, CentOS was actually acquired by Red Hat, and then later on, Red Hat itself was acquired by IBM. While that in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, the distribution is no longer a debranded version of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And that change was made very recently when it was announced that CentOS Stream would become the successor to CentOS as we used to know it. And CentOS Stream isn't quite the same thing as a rolling distribution. I mean, it is and it isn't as complicated. It's best to think of it as an evolving distribution, and it's no longer a one-to-one drop-in replacement for Red Hat like it used to be. New direction aside, CentOS is still a worthy distribution to check out. Now, it may not have the same focus as it used to have, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's less stable. It's a good fit for administrators that are looking for a more evolved enterprise distribution who don't necessarily have a requirement to be compatible with Red Hat. Now also on this list is AlmaLinux as well as RHEL. And I'm including both of those in the same section in this video because they're essentially the same thing more or less. When CentOS changed direction and was no longer a drop-in replacement for Red Hat Enterprise Linux, AlmaLinux and also RHEL stepped up to become what CentOS used to be. So AlmaLinux and RHEL are actually, well, drop-in replacements or debranded versions of Red Hat. So we get the same use case that we had with CentOS with these newer distributions. So I definitely recommend checking out AlmaLinux and or RHEL as well because, well, if you're a CentOS refugee or you just prefer the way that things used to be, then AlmaLinux and RHEL will both serve you well. Like I mentioned, they're drop-in replacements for Red Hat, so if it works on Red Hat, it'll work on those distros as well. They keep them up to date and they have great communities behind them, so you won't be disappointed. Now another distribution that I want to mention is Suse. Suse is available in multiple different versions. We also have OpenSUSE as well, which you could download for free. And then there's Suse Enterprise Linux that you can, well, download for a support agreement cost. Now Suse is actually available in multiple different versions. We have OpenSUSE, which you could download for free. There's also Suse Linux Enterprise Server available as well. But like Red Hat though, it's important to understand first and foremost that you can't download Suse Linux Enterprise Server for free like you can with OpenSUSE. You have to buy a support agreement for that distribution. So already, I guess that means we have a downside, or a potential downside. If Suse Enterprise is outside your budget, then, well, it may be out of reach. But if it does fit within your budget, Suse Enterprise is actually awesome. It's very stable, and it even has some similarities with Red Hat. I mean, when you consider the package type, it's RPM, for example, that's what it uses. But that's not the best thing here. One of the best things about Suse is YAST. Yast is one of those configuration utilities that is renowned within the Linux community, and even people that don't use Suse might actually like the idea of Yast and might even be jealous of not having it on their distribution, because just about everything that you might ever want to configure on your server, you could do so through Yast. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed this video and it's helped you narrow down your distro choice. I went over some of the most popular distributions in this video. And if there's a distribution that you think I should have covered, then definitely let us know in the comments down below. In the meantime, I really appreciate everybody checking out this video. Subscribe if you haven't already done so, and I'll see you again very soon.